Well, now we arrive at our final session for narrative genre, and that is sermon content. We're looking at sermon content, and we're going to look at the sermon content document. So when we think about the sermon content document, you remember the lecture we gave in the first class, in course number 1. And in that course, I went through each of the steps. Well, we'll start with this. None of the steps change. All of the steps are exactly the same, in the same order. There's no change whatsoever. So that's a good thing, right? So you may say, okay, well, then what's the big point? There's still a few what I call minor adjustments that you need to think about, and we're going to look at those. But when you look at the steps, and the first thing here in your notes is reviewing the steps, the introduction, the body, the conclusion. Here we talk about getting the attention of the hearers, surfacing the need for the hearers, describing the contemporary situation, historical situation, raising the questions, reading the passage, transition to the body. All of those things remain the same. No changes. Praise the Lord, right? And then you look at the body. You have explanation, illustration, argumentation, application, and they're for each of the house statements. That doesn't change either. Conclusion. You have those final 4 steps: appealing to the hearer's sense of logic and feelings, summarizing the passage, state the action required, make a direct appeal. So all of that stays the same. But when you think about the sermon content document, you got to think about a few minor adjustments. It's not adjustments to changing the steps, but when you get to certain steps, when you arrive at certain steps in the sermon content document process, when you're composing your sermon, you need to make sure you think about these adjustments. So I call this updated procedure for narrative genre. Updated procedure for narrative genre. So, as I said, no major changes in terms of the steps themselves, from the introduction, body, conclusion. When you preach through a narrative passage, a passage from a narrative genre, use the same exact steps that you did in composing the passages for the epistolary genre. Okay? We've talked about that. So what are these adjustments? But even though you use all the same steps listed above, the ones I've talked about, there's some adjustments that you need to make. Adjustment number 1. Adjustment number 1. When you're speaking the historical situation in the introduction, when you're talking about that historical situation, which when you look back up here, that's introduction and that's step 4. So when you're looking at the introduction, when you're in that area and you're going to that step and you're composing your document, the preacher will need to be able to summarize the context of the story by going back to your understanding of the flow of the book that you learned in setting analysis. If you remember our session on setting analysis, we talked about this is the aspect of the when and the where. You're looking at the different aspects, the political aspects, the cultural aspects, the temporal aspects, and other aspects. And remember that broader context of the story? Remember that one? I'm hoping you did that well when you did your setting analysis, because here's where it pays off. If you understand the broader context of the story, you can bring that into this sermon content document at this point, at this step of the process. You need to you understood the broader context of the characters, the broader context of the story, and all those things can help come here in this particular step of the historical situation. And if you include that information there, it's just going to give the information that you learned to your people. It will help the preacher develop that aspect of the sermon content document. So, when you're doing the historical background section in your step, it's a little bit different than the way you did the epistles. The epistles are not narrative. Here, you want to connect your story to the broader story and the broader context of the characters and the broader context of the story. You should have already done that research. You should already have that information. You want to bring it in at this point in your sermon. This is where that particular assignment really helps. And so you want to bring that in. The second adjustment that you need to make is when you're speaking the transition to the body. That's the final step in the introduction, called transition to the body. You're going to need to actually begin to formally tell the story. You're going to have to you don't want to preach the story. There's two extremes here. You could act like you're one of the characters in the story. You know, I'm Zacchaeus. That's one extreme I wouldn't do. That's not what your people are expecting you to do in terms of preaching the passage. You're not going to portray a character, okay? The other extreme would be you're kind of talking about the story without getting into it, without really it's like you're just an observer to it. You're speaking about it, but you never really walk us through it. You got to take us through the story. Yes, you have an outline, the how statements, but you still have to tell the story. You have to work us through the story so that we understand it, so that we can get captivated by it, so that we can get engrossed into the story itself. These are things that you need to do. So in the transition to the body section, which is the last step of the introduction, the preacher will need to begin formally telling the story and in terms of providing the setup information of the story that comes before the verses that are linked to the how element. Remember, when you did primary matters, not every verse in the story is included in a how statement. There may be verses outside of that are setup information. We talked about that. So the preacher, you need to focus upon the areas of the plot analysis. Go back to the plot, look it over, and determine the areas that you need to focus on when you get to the transition, because once you get to the body, then you're formally going through the how statements. And you want to be able to get us into the story so that when you transition to the body, to the how statement, to your first how statement, it flows right through. And if multiple situations are present in the passage, we talked about that aspect of it, then the preacher will need to address the areas of plot analysis in each situation that come before any of the verses that are included in the how element. So you want to be aware of these things. The transition to the body is a very critical, it comes at the introduction, it's a very critical point when preaching narrative genre, because this is how you get us involved in the story. Once you read the passage, then you begin formally going through it and helping us see it, and then keep walking us through it as you go through the how statements, the body of the sermon. And in our class time, we're going to talk more about this. I'm going to show you a little bit more about how to do this. Your professor will help you with that, because it's such a critical element in that part of the process of building your sermon content document and actually preaching that. Because we do want to think about sermon delivery, right? Remember that? About your use of your hands and your eyes and your voice, and your sermon content document can help you in being a better communicator of the sermon. The final category you want to think about, or adjustment that you want to think about, is when speaking the explanation. Remember, in the how statements in the body, you have the explanation. When you're speaking those, when you're explaining the passage, the preacher will need to make sure that he's continuing to tell the story as he explains the passage. So what you began to do in the transition to the body, you continue to do as you walk through the verses that connect with the how statements. So what verses connect with that how statement, the second how statement, third how statement, ever how many you have, each one of those, you still want to progress through the story. So in a sense, yes, you're telling the story, but you're telling it from a perspective because of what theological truth comes from it. You're doing both at the same time. And honestly, it just takes practice. It takes just doing it more and more and more. This is one of the unique differences between preaching narrative passages as opposed to the epistolary passages because the epistles are not a story. It wasn't written to be a story. But stories are stories. And so you need to think about that aspect of narrative genre. And so when you're preaching that, you got to tell us the story. You got to walk through the story. The hearers need to hear the story explained to them so that the theological truth contained within the story, within each house statement, it becomes very clear to them. Remember we talked about in Course 1, clarity. Clarity, you want it to be clear, understandable. You want them to understand the point of that narrative passage, just as you would want them to understand the point the author's making in the epistolary passages. It's just when you deal with narrative, you have to do it a little differently because it's a different genre. And so these are some of the adjustments you got to make. And I know this would be the struggle because you may not be used to this. This is new for you. That's why in our class sessions together, we can talk about this more and get some more practice on this. Deal with this to help you in terms of being able to tell the story as you walk through the passage. So these are the 3 adjustments that you need to make. So a couple final points I want to make. As the preacher preaches from narrative passages, as you would preach from a narrative passage, you must remember that the passage does tell a story. You must also remember the narrator, the biblical author who wrote the story. He's desiring to communicate theological truth from that story. So yes, you tell the story, but you also need to communicate the theological message that's inherent within the story, that is contained in the story. Therefore, every narrative sermon must be built upon the foundation of the what, why, how, the primary matters. So you want to consider that. We're not changing the primary matters process in that sense. I mean, you got before you can design your sermon, you got to think about the structure that it's built upon. And the way you get to the primary matters has changed a little, somewhat because of the exegetical process. But when you're preaching, yes, you got to preach a theological message, just as you would in the epistles. But since you're in narrative genre, you want to preach the story. You want to walk us through the story, interact with the characters. Let us know, understand who they are. You've been studying about these characters. You've studied who they are, what they're doing, what they're saying, why they say what they say. Give us that. Help bring the story to life while you at the same time give us the point of the passage that the author wants to communicate. So if you do good work in this, in completing the character, setting, scene, plot analysis, areas of exegesis, along with examining the significant words that are in the passage, you should be able to easily incorporate all of that information, all that information into your sermon content document. You'll be able to go back to those exercises, and it'll all connect together. And you'll prepare a document that will help you to walk us through the passage, take us through the passage, walk us through what the story is saying and the meaning behind that story and how it connects to our everyday life. Now, I've given you an example of a sermon content document for the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. You can look in your notes or down here on the page, on the web page. It's here. I call it the validity of true gospel ministry. That would be my title for this sermon. And you'll notice the introduction, the steps are there, the body, the conclusion. You can look through all of that information, all that material as an example. One thing I do want to remind you of, the sermon content document is not a manuscript. It was never meant to be a manuscript. It is not a manuscript. Whenever you preach, do not take your sermon content document to the pulpit. That's not what it's designed to do. Actually, if you do the sermon content document well, it's more than a manuscript. It's more information that you would ever say. Again, it's not everything you're going to say. It actually should be more. But what the sermon content document does, it helps keep you focused. It keeps you structured. It allows you to follow a pattern and a path that can be effective for sermon delivery so that the sermon can be clear, so that your exposition of the passage can be clear to your audience who need to hear it. And the sermon content document is the methodology that I employ to help you stay focused, help you stay clear. It keeps you from going here and going there and getting on tangents or personal theological hobby horses, we call them. It keeps you structured, keeps you focused. And that's exactly what you need to do. You only have so much time to preach. And don't you want your people, let me ask this question. Would you want your people to walk away out of the church service when the service is done and walk out of the church understanding the passage better than they did when they walked in? Not be more confused, but actually know what you're talking about? That's what you want to do. You want to do this well. You want to do this well so that you're able to actually be able to communicate the sermon in a way that will be meaningful to your people and helpful to them. So follow the sermon content document process. Follow that, work with that, and if you have any questions, let your professor know. We'll be dealing more with that in class. But again, make those adjustments that are needed and put your sermon content document together following the example that's provided.